and welcome to this presentation. My name is Daniel Morris. I can see a lot of attendees are already joining the room, so a very warm welcome to everybody today. I can see a couple of people in the chat already, so hello from SP, I guess that's Sao Paulo. So a warm welcome to you today joining. In today's session, as you can see, I'm going to be talking a bit about the flipped classroom in language teaching. A bit of a hot topic at the moment. A lot of educational practices are looking into the idea of the flipped classroom, especially now after a lot of time we've spent teaching online, for example. A lot of teachers now are becoming more connected with technology. So they're looking for new ways to integrate their synchronous and asynchronous learning. And personally, I feel that the flipped classroom approach is one of the best ways to do this. So this is a little bit about what this talk is about today. Before I go into the talk, just a little bit of information about me. Just to allow perhaps some more people to enter the room. As I said, my name is Daniel. I'm from England, and I work as an academic consultant for Express Publishing. I've been there now for 3 years. And with Express Publishing, I was very lucky before the pandemic. I was traveling a lot around the world, delivering academic presentations, seeing lots of teachers from all around the world, which was great for me. I always enjoyed speaking to teachers from different countries. Every time I go to an event, I always learn something new from the teachers that I'm talking to. And well, although we can't speak to each other face to face today, I'm very happy at least that you have the opportunity to communicate with me through the chat box. So if you do have any comments, if you do have any feedback, please do write inside the chat. I will be checking the chat box at the end of the presentation. I'd also like to encourage you to ask any questions that you like about today's presentation. You can write them in the Q&A box, I believe. I will make that available at the end of the session again, so that any questions that you have about the presentation, we can talk about together. I went off on a bit of a tangent there about talking about the chat and the Q&A. So anyway, yes, I'm an academic consultant for Express Publishing. Before I joined Express Publishing, I actually taught English in Spain. I was quite lucky to work in both public schools and language schools in Spain, teaching students from all different ages, from very young students all the way up to adults, and also business classes as well, business English classes. So it's about 5 past, so let's start the presentation. I'm going to share with you my screen so that we can have a look together. Okay, so hopefully you can see that in front of you. So I'm going to make that a bit bigger as well. So as I said, today's presentation is all about the flipped classroom in English language teaching. I'm going to explore today some ideas connected to the flipped classroom that help us to optimize both our synchronous and asynchronous learning. Now, key questions for today's presentation. First of all, what is the flipped classroom exactly, and how does it work? And can I flip my English language classroom? And if I want to flip my English language classroom, how can I do this in an effective way? How can I flip my classroom, but at the same time, ensure that my students are engaged in the lessons, and also make sure that my students accomplish their learning objectives for the lessons? How can I do this in an effective way? These are the two main questions that I will be looking at today, and we're also going to look at some practical examples for how we can actually flip the language classroom effectively. Before I go into that, however, I think an important question to ask, first of all, when we're considering flipping the language classroom or in the language teaching context, is what kind of learning is actually taking place. Now, it doesn't really matter what the learners are studying in the class or outside the class. Learning typically is taking place either synchronously with a teacher inside the classroom, or in the Zoom classroom, for example, with a group of students. Inside the synchronous classroom, we have a lot of communication between the teacher and the students. It's quite a feedback-friendly environment, and we have a lot of information going backwards and forwards. The teacher is delivering the lesson. The students are providing their own feedback to the teacher by maybe asking questions, by answering questions, or demonstrating some kind of skill for the teacher, and they receive this feedback, and that allows them to further facilitate or monitor or correct if necessary. Okay. On the other hand, we also have learning that takes place asynchronously. This is learners that take the time to study in their own time, disconnected from the actual classroom itself, on their own. Maybe students logging into an LMS platform, for example, or taking the time to complete some online exercises, or maybe even just some exercises from their book. The key feature of the asynchronous environment is that it is down to the student, really. It's their own time and space to engage with learning. And in general, this is how our learners are accessing learning in the 21st century. If we think about the traditional classroom, where the teacher was the center of knowledge, really, the students went to the class to listen to the teacher, make notes, they had their homework, for example. Now in the 21st century, students can access learning in many different ways, in a group space, in an individual space, online through an LMS platform, for example, with a teacher, in groups, in any way that they want to. And these are the two main areas that perhaps teachers try to balance quite a lot, the synchronous learning and the asynchronous learning, how they can be combined effectively. So why should we, or why blend asynchronous and synchronous learning together? Why should we combine them? Well, first of all, it gives us a lot of advantages in terms of preparation. For students that perhaps are working asynchronously at home through their LMS platform, completing exercises before the class, it allows for some preparation. It might allow us some more time inside the class if students come prepared with certain topics, for example, to maximize our class time, maximize our student talking time, maybe focus more on some of the productive skills inside the class. So it gives us a lot of advantages in terms of preparation, having that extra extension of the classroom in the online environment for students to do some work beforehand. In terms of differentiation, as teachers, we know that some of our learners, they learn best in a group, with talking with their classmates. We have some learners that they learn best on their own, doing some extra exercises by themselves, working through something independently. What blending asynchronous and synchronous learning does is it allows us to create different spaces for learners to access learning and demonstrate their skills. Thirdly, in terms of participation, some students inside a group space, as I mentioned before, through preparation tasks, maximizing perhaps face-to-face class time for speaking, for group work, for collaboration, for example, it allows more time for participation with certain students. At the same time, we may have students that prefer to participate in the lessons more individually. And they can do that in the asynchronous environment by completing some exercises on their LMS platform, by doing some extra work at home. They can still feel like they are participating inside the lessons because the teachers are able to quite often monitor their feedback or receive some kind of input from the learners that have been doing some work independently. So learners can feel like they're participating inside the class and also when they go home and they are connected electronically to the school, for example. And finally, we also have flexibility, making sure that through asynchronous and synchronous learning, our students have space, time, and freedom to access learning in many different ways, either individually or in a group at the same time. So blending them together can give us a lot of advantages. And this is something that we tried to do, I think, throughout the pandemic period. We were trying to stay connected with our students while we were physically disconnected from them in the face-to-face environment. So many of us looked to try and extend the classroom time to help students to study more independently, to help them to connect to the school when they couldn't physically be there themselves. And this is exactly where the flipped classroom comes into play. I think the flipped classroom is an excellent model, an excellent idea that blends both synchronous and asynchronous learning together and makes the best use of them. So what exactly is the flipped classroom then? So the flipped classroom, to give you a bit of context, a bit of background, the flipped classroom was first introduced in 2007 by two teachers from the United States. They were two chemistry teachers, and they coined the phrase flipped classroom as a way to redefine and reinvent their chemistry classes. What they did was they actually recorded parts of their chemistry lectures on videotapes and provided the students with access to the tapes so that they could watch the lectures at home as part of their homework. And this meant that when they actually went to the class, they had already received some kind of input from the teacher through the lecture. They already had some kind of foundational knowledge of the topics that they were going to cover in the lesson. And that meant that when they went to the actual class, they had more time to work on the application of these skills through lab work or doing more experiments, having more time to do that inside the classroom. And from there, the flipped classroom has had such a huge impact on education. It's very widespread throughout many different subjects. So much so that if you look online for a definition of the flipped classroom, you get literally hundreds of entries of the definitions for how to flip the classroom. What is the flipped classroom, for example? Here are two definitions of the flipped classroom that I found. And what I found in general with the flipped classroom is that it all seems to focus on the same idea. And it's this idea of flipping the traditional classroom where the teacher delivers the lesson, the students receive this information, maybe they take some notes, they go home and practice, for example, for their homework. It flips this process so that the learners do some kind of work at home, they study some kind of content before the lesson, so that when they arrive to the class, they then apply some of these skills with the teacher present in the room. This is the general idea of the flipped classroom. And this is why I think it's been so successful in ELT, especially across the curriculum. Now, with the widespread nature of the flipped classroom, this has also led to, of course, some common misconceptions, maybe some doubts, some concerns about how the flipped classroom is implemented. And what are the advantages exactly? What I'd like to do today is look at some of the common misconceptions of the flipped classroom. I think it can be a misunderstood concept sometimes. So, for example, number one, many people think that perhaps the flipped classroom is just a buzzword. It's just something, it's just a word, a term to get people excited. It doesn't really bring anything. Well, if we think about the flipped classroom, the idea of the flipped classroom is not something that is particularly new. Even before the flipped classroom, there was the idea of the inverted classroom. And this involved teachers, again, recording parts of their lessons and sending them to their students so that their students could revise a little bit or maybe do some extra practice at home. And as teachers, as educators, I'm sure that we've all at some point given our students some extra work at home to prepare for the next lesson. For example, the idea of having students come prepared to the lesson is not a brand new idea in English language teaching. And when we send our students home to do some work on their own, this can be seen as personalized learning. In a way, it's students taking more control of their learning And when they come to class, it allows them to perhaps demonstrate some of these skills directly with the teacher. So to say that the flipped classroom is just a buzzword, I think is a little bit too much in this context. I think the flipped classroom incorporates many different advantages and skills, and it's something that we use quite often, maybe without even knowing that we're using it inside our own classes. The second misconception, you either flip the classroom or you don't. I think a lot of teachers perhaps think that in order to flip their classroom, they have to flip every single part of the lesson. And this is something that I think is not true. The beauty of the flipped classroom is that you can decide which elements to flip. You can flip an entire module, you can flip an entire lesson, or you can flip maybe a couple of tasks, depending on your syllabus, depending on your students' needs. For example, you can assess what you want to flip and you can act accordingly on that. You don't have to flip your entire school year, for example, to engage in the flipped classroom. Number three, flipped content must be a video. I think a lot of people think that perhaps to do flipped classroom or flipped learning, teachers have to make hundreds and hundreds of videos of themselves. Perhaps in 2007, this was true. For teachers that didn't have access to LMS platforms like we do now, for teachers that didn't have access to YouTube, for example, for teachers that didn't have access to ebooks. Right now, we're a lot more connected with technology than we used to be. And the flipped classroom is all about the delivery of the learning to the students. The delivery of the learning can be through a video or through any of the media that I've mentioned already. It's much easier for us now to reach our students at home, outside of the classroom, through their ebooks, through their LMS systems, or simply just reading through their books and completing some exercises. We're a lot more capable now of reaching the students, and we don't have to always give them video content to watch. Number four, the teacher needs a lot of technical knowledge and time. I think this is the same as I mentioned for number three. Teachers in general now, I think we're a lot more connected to technology than we were 2-3 years ago. Even this pandemic period has taught us how to navigate through LMS platforms, how to conduct Zoom classes, how to record our lessons on Zoom, how to assign homework through ebooks, for example. We're a lot more adapted now to this technological world. And I think something like the flipped classroom can be something that we can quite easily adapt into our teaching methodologies, especially now with the influence of technology. And finally, maybe our students, they might not appreciate the flipped classroom. This is something that perhaps we need to think about in terms of our delivery. If our students are just going home to watch videos all the time, then perhaps maybe they won't be engaged so much. The challenge with the flipped classroom is how we engage the learners through the learning. What are we going to attach to the video content or to whatever content they're studying at home to engage them? What are we going to attach to it to help them to develop their skills, to connect with the topics, for example? If we can find that, then perhaps our students might be a bit more appreciative, and it can be something we can include inside our lessons. Okay, so these are just some common misconceptions and something that I wanted to clear up today, as of course, with the flipped classroom, with its widespread nature, it is quite common that there are concerns and doubts about how it's used. So how does the flipped classroom work exactly? I've talked about it already through the definition of the flipped classroom, but let's have a look in a bit more detail. So if we imagine the traditional classroom, the teacher stands at the front of the class, and this is all about the content delivery. The teacher teaches the lesson, the students listen to the teacher, they make some notes, and they go home and practice at home. Okay? And this is what we do in our typical lessons, and there's nothing wrong with this. This is how we teach. This is how we do things. However, the flipped classroom gives us another approach. It gives us another alternative here. In the flipped classroom, the content delivery takes place at home. The students study content, either a video or through some other form. And from this, they get some kind of knowledge, some kind of input that when they go to the class, they can then put into practice. And when they put this into practice, most importantly, they are in a group space, they are with their classmates, and they're with the teacher at the same time. the teacher is there to facilitate and monitor during the process when the students are actually applying the skills that they have studied. In the traditional classroom, perhaps this stage takes place at home without the teacher. Perhaps there's a tendency for students to get stuck. There's a tendency for students to perhaps not really know how to put these skills into practice. They need maybe someone to guide them through. This is where the flipped classroom can have many advantages. And if we think about the flipped classroom, many of the approaches to flipping the classroom are based on Bloom's taxonomy. If we think about the different levels of cognition, okay, starting with the lower order thinking skills, remembering and understanding facts and concepts, for example, then moving into the application, the analytics of these concepts through to evaluation and creation. Okay, if we think about the flipped classroom approach, when students are studying content at home, they are essentially focusing on the lower order thinking skills. These skills would normally be worked on perhaps inside the classroom when the teacher is delivering the lesson, but in the flipped classroom, these students are working through this at home. They are remembering and understanding, studying content at home, and then in class, when they come to the classroom, they can have the opportunity to work on some of the higher order thinking skills, the application, perhaps the creation, the evaluation stage. All of these kind of higher order thinking skills take place with the teacher present. So this can also be an advantage of the flipped classroom. The teacher is actually present during the application of the higher order thinking skills. And I'm going to borrow here from Aaron Sams. He's one of the creators of the flipped classroom that I mentioned before. He says that the flipped classroom, above all, it's more than a methodology. It's more about a mindset. It's more about a way of organizing learning. It's about redirecting the attention away from the teacher and putting the attention on the learners themselves and how they learn. Now, I don't know about you, but me as a teacher, I think my maximum attention for my students would be when they are actually applying these skills, when they are working through the skill application, the higher order thinking skills. That's when I want my maximum attention to be on my students, to see the end result, to see the productive skills, to see them working, collaborating, demonstrating skills and mastery in different ways. And this is something that can work quite well with the English language classroom. Okay, how can we flip the English language classroom? Well, if we think about it, our PPP method, our presentation, practice, and production method, works quite well with the flipped classroom approach. If we think about the presentation stage, the lesson taking place at home, with students studying individually through content, this can then allow us to maximize our face-to-face class time for the practice and production stages. As I mentioned earlier, this is where perhaps we want to put a lot of our attention on the learners when they're practicing the vocabulary or the grammar that they've been studying. And when they are perhaps communicating, speaking, or doing some writing or delivering a presentation, for example. During all of this time, the flipped classroom gives the teacher the opportunity to be present during these stages, to monitor and facilitate as they go through. So this can be some strong reasons to actually flip the language classroom itself, and it works quite well with the methodology that we already have in English language teaching. It can allow us to adapt it slightly so that we separate the different stages of the lesson to the asynchronous part through the presentation, and then the synchronous part where students are practicing and producing language. Okay, now this is all very well said and done, but how do I actually go about doing it? It's very easy to say that you can flip the classroom, but how can I actually do it? So John Bergman, he's the other creator of the flipped classroom. He gives us some valuable insight here. So we're just going to watch a quick video. He explains some of the key things that we should take into account when we flip our classroom.
You see, the key to the flipped classroom is maximizing the face-to-face class time. For 24 years, I was a high school science teacher. And in my science class, I was frustrated with not having enough time for my kids to do hands-on activities, and also for them to get help on, I'll call it the hard stuff. You see, because what I was doing is I would send them home to do homework, and they'd get stuck, and they wouldn't have any help because their parents couldn't help, say, on high school chemistry. And so when they went home, they couldn't do it. So of course, when we flipped the class, there was a lot more time for me, the expert, to help the student with their class. So for me, the way I answered that question as a high school chemistry teacher was I wanted my students to do more experiments and also to get help on the more difficult concepts. But then my PE teacher friends, they had a different answer to that question. What's the best use of your face-to-face class time? So I want to really encourage you to answer that question for yourself. What is the best use of your face-to-face class time? And as you answer that, I think you're going to come to the conclusion that it's not you standing up in front of your students and yakking at them doing the lecture thing. Because you can move the direct instruction piece, if you will, the lecture, into the individual space where the students can watch them and consume them at the pace that makes sense to them.
Okay, so hopefully you were able to follow the video. I don't know about the quality of the sound. Maybe the sound wasn't so good. So just to give you a summary of what he said, when it comes to flipped learning, the key thing to keep in mind is, how do I want to maximize my face-to-face class time? What do I want to spend my class time working on with the students, essentially? For John Bergman, for the chemistry teacher, this was doing lab work and experiments. And to do that, he wanted the students to first study some of the theory at home so that they could then apply that in the experiments in the class. For us, as language teachers, we may have different ideas about what is the best use of our class time. So I ask to you maybe to think at home right now, what could be the best use of your class time when you get students together inside the class? Perhaps we may have some similar ideas here. When we get our students together inside the classroom, perhaps speaking and writing, collaboration, communication, active learning. We want the students to feel like active participants within the lesson. We don't want them to be passively sitting there just listening or not really paying attention. We want them to be actively part of the lesson. We might want to engage the students in projects, in debates, discussions, for example, delivering presentations. And at the same time, as the teacher, a good use of our class time could also be for ourselves to conduct some kind of formative assessment with the students, monitor them. How are they communicating? How are they collaborating together? What kind of project work are they doing? How was their presentation, for example? And all of this can take place inside the synchronous learning space. This is what we want to make the best time of when we're together inside the classroom, or when we're together inside the online classroom either. Now, what can students do at home then in order to prepare themselves for this? This can be a more tricky question, I think. What can the students do at home in order to prepare for the work that we do in class? And perhaps most importantly, how can we hold the students accountable for doing this work at home? It's like I said a few moments ago, we don't want to just send our students home to watch videos. We need a way to actually engage them and make sure that the work they're doing at home is integrated with the work that they will do inside the lesson. So there are a few options that we can do here. Of course, the number one, watch a video or even create a PowerPoint. I know teachers throughout the pandemic that created their own PowerPoint presentations in order to present vocabulary and grammar structures. The students would watch them at home, for example, for revision purposes or to prepare them for the lesson, for example. Students have access, of course, to online course material. They can open their ebooks. They can go onto the LMS system. The teacher can maybe upload some of the work there, some worksheets, for example. They can even read their physical or digital texts that they have at home. They may have access to their books at home. And connected to that, we may want to engage them through some quizzes, online quizzes or online tasks connected to the PowerPoint that they've watched or connected to the video. We may want to assign them some exercises on the LMS system, for example, assign them some homework tasks. or we may want them to do some internet research, to come to the class prepared with some kind of research on a topic to discuss in the next class. This way we can make sure that the students are accountable in some way for doing the work at home, for studying, and making sure they get some of the early practice before they come to the lesson. So here is a few ideas that we could use to make sure that students are prepared at home first. Okay, and of course, this takes place inside the asynchronous environment. This is the time where students take their own time, they connect in their own space, and they have the freedom to work through the material that they want to and complete the tasks. Okay, so this is where we can sort of bridge the synchronous class with the asynchronous class. Okay, now what can I flip in the English language classroom? Getting a bit more specific now. What is it exactly that I can flip in my English lesson? To answer this question, I think the key here is to look at our aims and objectives. Look through our course books, look through the teacher's books. What are my aims for the lessons? What do I want my students to achieve inside the class? And from there, we can then begin to think about what can be studied at home, what parts of the lesson aims could be accomplished at home, and which parts of the lesson in particular do I want to spend some time on practicing them inside the class. Okay, so this is where we get our asynchronous and synchronous focus again. Okay, and to do this, what I've done personally is to look through my lesson objectives from my course book. Something that we do quite often as teachers. We look through our aims, we look through the objectives, we look through the learning outcomes, and then start thinking, okay, what are we going to do at home? What are the students what can they do inside the class? Here we have some aims and objectives from a primary level book. It's for grade 6. Okay, in this particular lesson, we're going to be introducing some vocabulary. The vocabulary is about the solar system, the planets, for example, and from there, the students are going to practice some of the language that's been studied. They're going to do some speaking practice too. So here are my aims, and I've been thinking about how to incorporate this into a flipped classroom approach. Okay, so in the traditional classroom, for example, we might just simply present the vocabulary of the planets, do some listening, some repeating, some drilling exercises, for example, and then move on with the activities. But I want to do this in a flipped classroom approach. So my aims for the lesson, for the first part of the lesson, is to introduce the topic of the module and to present the planets in the solar system. And to do this, I'm going to first have the students prepare a bit at home, okay, in the asynchronous space through a video. Okay, I have a video that helps me to present the vocabulary words. This is a video that comes with the course. So it's something that I've chosen intentionally because I know that my students can connect and they can study at home, and it gives them a lot of useful input that I could also do inside the class. Okay, so having a look at the video, and connected to the video, some questions that quite nicely supplement the video, just to check the student's general understanding of the video itself and the topic. Okay.
Beyond the stars, there are 8 planets in our solar system. These planets go around the Sun, which is a star. Mercury is the closest planet to the Sun. This planet is made of rock. It's very hot during the day and very cold at night.
Okay, so I think you get the general idea. So students watch the video at home. They complete some very low stakes exercises in order to show some general understanding of the topic. And at home, you can see here, I want them to focus on the lower order thinking skills, simply reading or looking at the video, understanding the general idea, remembering and understanding. Okay. So in the flipped classroom, then, having watched the video at home, okay, having introduced the topic, then inside the flipped classroom, we might want to focus more on the application of the skills here, the application of the knowledge that the students have acquired at home. Here we have the aims, okay, to learn more about the planets in the solar system and to consolidate the language of the lesson. Here we can have students working in groups. They are doing a bit of practice here, naming the planets. Okay, what can you remember from the video that you watched at home? Check your answers online or with the teacher. The teacher, of course, we're going to be there. We can help them. We can facilitate. We can monitor. And here we move more into the higher order thinking skills. The students are applying some of the knowledge that they've studied at home. They can be working in groups to check through their answers, for example. Okay, and we can spend more time on this during the class. And in this particular lesson, what I really like about this lesson is that to consolidate the language, the students then prepare their own quiz about the planets they've learned about. Okay, so they write a true or false quiz about the planets. The students can do this in groups, okay, working together, writing their questions, for example, and then you can swap the quizzes and different groups answer different questions. And again, as a teacher, we can monitor throughout this process. We can go around the class. We can make sure the students are on track. We can help them in any way. They're applying what they've studied before at home. And again, we're getting more into the higher order thinking skills here. We're even getting into creation here. The students are creating their own quizzes. They're using what they've studied at home to create something else, something new, something original. Okay, so this is something that we can apply inside the classroom. This is what I use for vocabulary. We can quite easily use this for grammar as well. If you have, for example, grammar theory, maybe have the students study some of the grammar theory at home, and then when they come to class, focus more on the spoken tasks connected to the grammar, so that students they put into practice some of the grammar rules that they've been looking at home, for example. And again, we get more into the higher order thinking skills, students perhaps more independently using the grammar rules inside the classroom, working on speaking, communication, collaboration, for example. So these are just a couple of ideas for how to flip the classroom, looking at our lesson aims and then deciding how we can engage the students at home individually, and then inside the class, how can we build on these skills? Those were just a couple of examples. What I'd like to do now is look at how we can engage learners in flipped learning. Flipped learning is a slight extension of the flipped classroom. Okay, the flipped learning model engages students more thoroughly in the learning. Rather than just taking a couple of exercises, flipped learning can be applied to an entire lesson within a module, for example. And quite usefully, actually, the flipped learning network has a very useful framework on how to flip your learning inside your classroom based on the 4 pillars of flipped learning, the flip pillars to be exact. And just to summarize them, it involves, first of all, creating a flexible environment, making sure students have access to learning content at home when they come to class, making sure that they have plenty of opportunities to demonstrate skills in different ways, in groups, through project work, through presentations, for example. It also involves establishing a learning culture with the learners, being able to scaffold exercises effectively, being able to prepare the students to engage with the content at home. This is an important part of the flipped learning approach, building a learning culture, making sure the students are engaged and invested in the process itself. So providing the adequate support, the scaffolding, the preparation, and allowing students to engage with flipped learning in a supported way. The third point is intentional content. Here I'm going to borrow from Russell Stannard. For those of you who know Russell Stannard, he's also a big advocate of the flipped classroom approach. It's all about knowing your course book, okay? Looking through your course book, which activities will benefit students most in the individual space, which activities will benefit the students the best in the group space. Knowing what you have in your course book, knowing what kinds of tasks you have there can really help you in planning the flipped approach. And finally, the role of the professional educator, being able to monitor your students, provide feedback, and also talk with other teachers that are engaging in the flipped model and sharing ideas with them. If you want to see the full framework for the flipped learning approach. The website is at the bottom there. It provides a lot of useful tips there for how to flip your learning effectively. Okay, something else that I also refer to when I want to flip my lesson is a useful guide from the Rochester Institute of Technology based on the flipped classroom model. You can see in front of us that we have 7 steps, okay, to flip the lesson. And in each step, we consider the different stages of the lesson. Okay, in step 1, we think about our student outcomes. What do we want the students to achieve, both outside of the class and inside the class? What kind of lower order thinking skills, perhaps, do we want the students to focus on? And what kind of higher order thinking skills will we build on inside the class? We also need to do this. We also need to select our content. What is it that students will be studying? And how are we going to deliver this content to the students? Will we provide them with a video? Will we create our own content? Will we find something extra to give them? Okay, so planning the first part, the outside of the class work. And then when students return to the classroom, how are we going to assess what they've done outside of the classroom? How are we going to feedback? How are they going to feedback what they've done outside of the classroom? And then how are we going to engage the students in the next part? How are we going to take what they've learned at home and put that into the next part of the lesson? So selecting activities in step 6 that extend the students' learning from what they've done individually in the group space. And of course, number 7, how we coach students. How are we providing them with the adequate support throughout? How are we monitoring their progress? How are we, the teacher, be able to facilitate this process? So it's quite a useful framework that I find. And what I'm going to do now for the last part of the presentation is to see how we can apply this to a lesson. Okay, so for this particular lesson, we have a reading lesson from a secondary level book. In this book, the students are going to, of course, they're going to practice some reading. They're going to practice different reading skills. They're also going to be engaging in some speaking and writing as well. For this lesson, I looked first of all at my aims, my objectives for the lesson itself, and from this, I identified my student outcomes. What are students going to do outside of class? Okay. I want them to be able to read and understand the text and maybe answer some questions. So this is something that the students can perhaps do before the class at home. And then in class, we want the students to compare and describe different houses. They're going to be considering whether to buy or rent at the strange house that they're talking about. And this can actually lead into a project as well. So this is what I want to really focus my class time on the students discussing different ideas, preparing some spoken work, some written work, for example. And my module objectives here helped me to understand and think about what I want to achieve in the asynchronous lesson part of the lesson and the synchronous part of the lesson. Okay, so that's the first step. I know what I want my students to achieve. Now let's look at the next step. The next step for me would be to establish some kind of pre-homework task. Select my content. My content is going to be a reading task. For the pre-homework task, okay, setting the scene, providing some kind of scaffolding, have a picture discussion, look at the pictures with the students, look at the house, what's strange about it, what do you think the text is going to be about? Okay, so for your homework, you're going to read through the text and we're going to discuss it next lesson. Having this preparation, having this kind of scaffolding can help prepare the students for the task. At the same time, we're establishing this learning culture. Okay, we are bringing into the class this kind of idea that we are preparing the students to go and do some independent work at home. And we're selecting our content for them to study. So then when students go home, I am giving them the reading task. And again, I've chosen this on purpose as this reading task also has a video connected to it. So I allow some kind of flexibility there. The students can watch the video. Okay, it's a different way for them to access the video. They can look through their LMS system. Okay, complete some exercises in their LMS for the video. Okay. Or they can simply read through the text itself and answer the questions in their book. I'm giving them some flexibility there in in order to do the task, in order to complete the reading. Okay, and we can also have, of course, them checking some words in the dictionaries, for example, to do with the text. Okay, so just some preparation at home. My delivery method is either through the video, which works very nicely with their learning platform. They can log in, watch the video, and they can complete some exercises, which I can monitor, or they can simply read through the book and complete some exercises.
The walking house.
Okay, so they can watch the video. Now, when they get back to class, then we can move more into the application stage. Okay, having watched the video at home, having done some preliminary exercises at home to check their understanding, we can then move more into the application, having some discussion topics. What did you learn from the text, for example? What did you find interesting about the text? Would you like to live in a walking house, for example? Having these kinds of questions for students to discuss when they get back to the class, maybe providing them with some more specific reading questions so that they can work through these exercises. Again, choosing intentional content, content that's going to allow students to provide you with some feedback, allow them to apply the skills that they've already studied at home, and to discuss the topics. Okay, and leading on from that, we can select different activities from the lesson. We can then focus on a speaking task, for example, get students in groups or in pairs. Think about how does the house that they've studied differ from theirs. Write down some notes, have a discussion with their partner. For example, in groups, analyzing, discussing the text that they've studied before, and then moving into a writing task. The students then write some reasons why or why not, why they don't like the house, if they would buy it or not. For example, here we're moving more into evaluating what they've studied, some more critical thinking about what they've studied at home. And this actually leads into a nice project at the end, having the groups of students come together and designing, thinking about their own future house based on the text that we've been studying at home and in the class. So what kind of shape is the house? How many rooms has it got? Where is it located? What are its special features, for example? The students can work together inside the classroom. They can brainstorm some ideas. Part of their homework could also be to go home and prepare some kind of a presentation, a poster maybe, that they can then present in the next class. So this activity can nicely go into a homework task that can then flow into the next lesson, where the different groups come back, present their futuristic house, and perhaps we can have further discussion. We can have a vote on which house do you think is the craziest idea, which house do you think is the most practical, for example. So it opens up a lot of doors there. And through flipping the class, here I really wanted to try and maximize the time for the speaking, the writing, for this kind of project work, so that while I'm in the class with the students, I have this time to actually see how they approach these activities. I'm there to monitor and facilitate while they're doing the speaking tasks, while they're preparing their projects, for example. It gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedom as teachers to see this process. Okay, and of course, you might ask yourselves, okay, so how would I be able to assess the flipped classroom? How can I coach my students? How can I make sure that the students are on track? Here is some metadata that I collected from students doing the video activity. Through LMS systems, through online quizzes, for example, we're able to receive scores, feedback from the students. So before the students even come to the class, I can see who has done the homework, who has watched the video, and what score they got. We can see maybe I might need a bit of extra practice. I might need to clarify a few points first, or maybe the students understand it and we can work further. So the flipped classroom model allows a lot of advantages there in terms of the assessment, in terms of collecting information from the students. And while, of course, the students are doing the productive tasks inside the class, as the professional educator, as the teacher, as the facilitator, this is a great time for me to perhaps focus on some formative assessment with the students. Maybe using one of these forms, for example, monitoring the students, writing down their names, writing some comments, some feedback on the presentation work that they've been doing, on the speaking work that they've been doing too. So there are different ways there that we can coach the students, either in the work that they do at home or with the work that they are doing inside the classroom as well. This is really what I wanted to show you with this lesson, the flexibility that we can give the students in terms of accessing the material online at home, for example, and then the application of these skills inside the classroom, selecting different activities that help our students to maximize communication skills, collaboration skills, and all the while we're able to coach and monitor them effectively. So conclusions then for the flipped classroom. I think that definitely it can combine both asynchronous and synchronous learning through students preparing at home, working through video content or studying content at home and applying these basic concepts inside the classroom. It can definitely work. It can definitely result in a better use of class time, as I hoped to show you through the examples, maximizing time for project work, communication, spoken skills, for example, having students prepared before the classroom. And it can most definitely be implemented in ELT, as we saw together, making use of our presentation, practice, production stages of the lesson, looking at our objectives, our aims, for example, can really help us to build a framework for the flipped classroom. And it can absolutely be assessed in many different ways through LMS platforms. They give us that luxury to be able to monitor student progress, to track how they've been doing. We can also, of course, use formative assessment, as I mentioned, and the flipped classroom can absolutely be part of your syllabus too. As teachers, it's all about, as I said already, knowing our course books, working through our aims. What do we want our students to accomplish at home? What can we do inside the class to maximize participation and engagement inside the class? So it can most definitely be part of our syllabus as well. So I'm going to bring the presentation to a close there. Thank you very much to all of you who have joined me here today. I really appreciate you sticking with me to the end. If you want to know more about Express Publishing, about our academic material, you can find our website here, www.expresspublishing.co.uk. There you can find a range of the different ELT materials that we provide. I'm just going to stop sharing the slides now and come out of there, because now I think we have about 8 to 10 minutes left. So I'm very welcome to any questions that you may have, any comments. I'll be very happy to stick around for the next 10 minutes to answer any questions that you may have about today's presentation. Okay, so I actually have I have some questions here actually. So wow, a lot of questions. Thank you very much for these. So I'm going to post the questions and we can talk about them. Let me see if I can do this Q&A. Okay, so this question comes from Alice. What was it like for you to teach in Spain? Teaching in Spain was a great experience for me. I got to teach a lot of different students of different ages, different levels, different abilities, and it gave me a lot of experience to see primarily how different students were inside the classroom, especially when it came to speaking. I had a lot of students that struggled a lot with their speaking inside the classroom, and it was kind of nice for me to see their progression during this time. And I had a great experience there, and I still keep in contact with the school, with at least one of the schools I was with there. So it was a great experience for me. Thank you, Alice, for your question. Just have a look at some more. Okay. This question comes from Fernando. How can a teacher monitor the presentation stage in a flipped classroom? This is a good question. I think for the presentation stage of the flipped classroom, this is kind of what I was saying with the accountability during the presentation. attaching tasks that help students to show some kind of general understanding of the topics, whether that be a couple of true or false questions, or questions about the video itself, or whatever kind of content they're looking at. Something that the students can fill out, preferably something that they can submit maybe through the LMS. And this can help us to perhaps check their progress before the lesson and have some kind of idea about how the students have done during this particular stage of the lesson. I know it's something that perhaps can be a bit tricky, because normally during the presentation stage we are there delivering the class, but the flipped classroom, through this kind of asynchronous element, through students working through content and the scores being sent back to the teacher, for example, this can help us, I think, to get some kind of idea of how students are performing during this particular stage of the lesson. Okay, just going to look through some more. Okay, another question from Fernando. What elements are important to take into consideration to be sure that the content delivery or presentation stage will be well assimilated by the student in order to have a productive class? I think, again, this goes with the tasks that are attached to the presentation stage. Okay, so low stakes tasks that help students to demonstrate a general understanding of the topic. For example, I think it's also very important that when we get back to the physical class itself, we have some kind of opportunity for a discussion of the topic. So if that's vocabulary, just a quick recap. For example, if that's something to do with a reading text, maybe having these kind of questions like, what did you find interesting about the text? Maybe what did you find difficult about the text? What do you want to learn more about in the text? This can perhaps help us, again, to have some kind of idea inside the class if we want to move into the next part of the lesson, to the practice, the production stage, to have this kind of feedback at the beginning of the class. Okay, any more questions? Okay, another question from Fernando again. How do you deal with feedback and assess students in the flipped classroom? This is something that I mentioned already. Again, so having some kind of feedback at the beginning of the class, looking through, if you have access to the LMS systems that give you scores, for example, this can be a way to do that. When you're inside the flipped classroom, having these kind of formative assessment sheets can really help at the same time as well to gather information about the students. There's a lot of questions here, so bear with me as I go through them. Okay, this question comes from Rodrigo. How can I teach grammar in a flipped classroom? I think I did mention something about this earlier. When it comes to grammar, if we think about, again, the presentation of the grammar, this can be a bit tricky sometimes. What you could do is, when we come to our typical kind of grammar theory boxes that we find in our books, for example, what we could do is, if it's something that we want the students to be familiar with at home, we could have the students to look through the grammar theory a bit at home, have some of the preliminary exercises, some of the gap filling tasks connected to that, so that students can first familiarize themselves with the grammar rules, complete a couple of exercises there to check their general understanding, and then when we get into the classroom, of course, have some feedback, clarify any points, and then perhaps move more into the communicative tasks connected to the grammar. Okay, this could be one way to do that. to teach the flipped grammar in that classroom. And again, maybe the students need some kind of scaffolding before they go home and study the theory. Okay, there's nothing wrong with doing a couple of exercises first, or just a bit of presentation. Then students go through and study at home, and then when they get back to the class, they do some of the work there, focused more on the communication. Okay. Okay, I can't really see any more questions here. A lot of comments. I'm going to switch back to the chat. Okay, go back to Q&A. A couple of comments here that I couldn't see the chat during the presentation. I apologize for that. As I was sharing my screen, I wanted to share my screen with you today so that you could see the animations, see the videos properly in the presentation. That meant that I couldn't at the time see the chat. So I apologize if I wasn't able to communicate with you during the presentation. That's why I allowed 10 minutes at the end here, just to make sure that we have some kind of feedback and some talking there. This is actually my first time using this platform, so maybe next time I'll be a bit more tech savvy during the presentation. But I thank you all for your comments and your feedback and your questions. I really appreciate receiving them all. Okay, I found another question here. How do you hold students accountable for what they need to do at home? What if some students don't do their homework? Okay, so this is a difficult question to think about, really. I did mention about holding students accountable by connecting certain tasks they do at home with some kind of quiz, online quizzes, tasks they do in their book, tasks they do in their LMS platforms, for example. This is perhaps a way to hold them accountable, so they're not just watching videos at home, they're not just reading something and then not doing anything with it. If students don't do their homework, this can be something that it's difficult to manage, but maybe we can look at it at a different perspective. If we do have students that come to class and they haven't done the homework, when they see that we're then having a discussion about the topics, maybe this can be an encouragement for them to actually do the work at home, because if they don't do the work before, they won't be able to engage in the discussion, they won't be able to engage in the project work effectively. What you could also do, if you have students that maybe they don't do the homework because they miss the lesson or they miss the class for whatever reason, a good way to kind of have this feedback session is for the students who have done the work before the class to kind of give a summary to the students who have missed the class or who haven't done it. Okay, this way the students that have done the work, they get to, in a way, teach some of the content, they get to apply what they've studied at home and bring the other students up to speed. But I think if you work that way, in that you have the students working with the discussions, working with these kinds of activities, the ones that don't do the homework, they're going to realize quite quickly that if they're not doing the homework at home, they won't be able to engage in the lesson with the students, with the other students. They won't be able to communicate with them or engage in these kinds of collaborative tasks. That can be one way to do it, I think. Let's see. Okay, question here. Is the session being recorded? I think it is. It does say it's being recorded, which is great. So I'm sure you'll be able to watch the session again. I can't see any more questions for now. I'm sorry if I've missed any of your questions. I've tried to go down as much as I can. There's another question here from Fernando. Fernando, you've asked a lot of questions today. I'm very happy that you asked a lot of questions. I'm really glad that you participated in the webinar. what are some disadvantages of flipping the class? Well, if we look at flipped classroom in terms of its advantages, okay, obviously it does help us to combine the what happens outside the class with what happens inside of it. Talking about some of the disadvantages, perhaps things that we've already talked about, maybe early on, some student disengagement, maybe even some pushback from parents if they feel that the students are simply watching videos at home. Maybe it's something that we need to make sure. This is why we need to make sure that what students doing at home is connected to the learning, that they are doing tasks at the same time, that they're engaging in some way. More disadvantages of the flipped classroom. Perhaps maybe if it's something new, maybe something that I did mention before, that maybe we do need at the beginning at least some kind of time. We need some kind of idea about what we're doing in terms of the syllabus, for example. So we do need some kind of understanding as well of technology, how it works, for example, to be able to do that. This is something that perhaps we need to maybe invest a bit more time in terms of the preparation at the beginning. But I think once we get past that stage, once we become more accustomed to using the technology in the classroom, to planning the classes around this kind of flipped approach, it becomes more easy for us. And by having video content at our disposal, we may have students that have prepared videos in the past. We can then use this or recycle these videos or this content for future classes as well. So I think when you first start off, it can be a bit of a disadvantage in terms of the preparation and knowledge that's required to do it. But as you get more into it, I think then you see the advantages. You get almost like a library of content that you can recycle again and again with your students too. Okay, so that could be one potential disadvantage that could then become an advantage if we work at it enough. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I think that's all the questions that I can see for now. And I think I've slightly overstayed my welcome a little bit with the timing and everything. So I think I'm going to end the session there. Again, a big thank you to everyone who participated today. I really appreciate your comments and your feedback on the presentation. I hope that it was useful, or at least has given you perhaps some ideas that you can take into your class in the future as well. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with you again, perhaps in person next time. So take care. It's goodbye from me. Enjoy the rest of the events, the webinars today, and I hope to see you very soon. Okay.